Imagine a city that looks ordinary on the surface: streets, factories, apartment blocks, trains arriving and leaving every day. A place that doesn't immediately signal horror. No massive gates, no infamous slogans above an entrance, just a working Polish city under occupation. And yet, for tens of thousands of people, this city became a trap, a place where survival narrowed day by day, where starvation was policy, terror was routine, and disappearance was almost guaranteed. This is the story of Camp Radom, and of a system of persecution that didn't rely on one single camp, but on an entire city transformed into a machine of destruction. Radom was not Auschwitz, it was not Treblinka. It did not exist as a single, clearly defined extermination site. That is precisely why it remains so little known. Radom represents a different kind of Nazi crime, one that unfolded through forced labor camps, ghettos, prisons, and execution sites woven directly into everyday urban life. Here, genocide did not arrive suddenly. It crept in through regulations, hunger, labor demands, and fear, until an entire community was crushed without the world ever focusing its attention. Before the war, Radom was home to a large Jewish population. Jewish families lived, worked, prayed, and traded alongside their Polish neighbors. Shops lined the streets. Synagogues stood openly. Life was not perfect, but it was life, rooted, familiar, and human. All of that began to collapse in September 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland and Radom fell under occupation. From the beginning, Radom was important to the German war effort. It was an industrial center, with factories capable of producing weapons, equipment, and supplies. The Nazis did not see Radom as a place to destroy immediately. They saw it as a resource, and its people as tools. Jews were stripped of rights almost overnight. Businesses were seized. Movement was restricted. Violence became normalized. And then came the ghettos. By 1941, the Jewish population of Radom was forced into sealed districts under brutal conditions. Overcrowding was extreme. Food was scarce. Disease spread rapidly. Starvation was not a side effect. It was intentional. The ghettos were designed to weaken, isolate, and control, preparing the population for what would come next. People died daily, quietly, without transports or gas chambers. Hunger did the work. At the same time, forced labor camps began operating in and around Radom. Jewish men and women were rounded up for labor details tied directly to German factories, railroads, and military supply chains. These were not temporary work assignments. They were labor camps designed to extract everything from a person until nothing remained. Beatings were routine. Medical care was non-existent. Exhaustion was constant. Anyone who could not keep up was removed, and removal usually meant death. This is where Radom becomes especially important to understand. The Nazis did not rely on one single camp here. They created a network: labor camps, prisons, police detention sites, and execution grounds all operating together. Prisoners were shuffled between them. A person could survive one camp only to be sent to another with worse conditions. Survival was unstable, temporary, and fragile. In 1942, everything accelerated. This was the year of Operation Reinhardt, the Nazi plan to annihilate the Jewish population of occupied Poland. Radom was no exception. Deportations began. Entire families were rounded up, forced onto trains, and sent primarily to Treblinka, where almost none survived. The ghettos were liquidated in waves, streets filled with panic, violence, and death. Those deemed unfit for transport, the sick, the elderly, children, were often shot on the spot. For those not deported immediately, forced labor became even more brutal. Camps tied to factories such as weapons plants and workshops expanded. Prisoners worked longer hours on less food. The goal was no longer even temporary survival. It was maximum exploitation before inevitable death. And yet Radom was never labelled a death camp. That label allowed it to fade from public memory. But make no mistake, for the people trapped there, Radom was a place where life expectancy was measured in weeks or months, not years. As the war dragged on, Radom's Jewish population was almost entirely erased. Some died in the ghettos, some were worked to death in labor camps, most were deported and murdered elsewhere. By the time the Germans began retreating, the city had been stripped of an entire community that had existed there for generations. What remained were factories, empty streets, and silence. In the next part, we'll go deeper into how the Radom camp system actually functioned. The labor camps, the daily routines, the violence, and the way an ordinary city was turned into an instrument of genocide without ever becoming a single famous camp. Radom did not need barbed wire stretching across the horizon to function as a killing system. Its strength lay in organization, bureaucracy, and routine. The Nazi authorities transformed forced labor into the backbone of control, using exhaustion and fear as efficiently as bullets. Across the city and its outskirts, a series of labor camps, workshops, and factory compounds emerged, each tied directly to German military production. These were not marginal operations. They were essential to the war effort, and the people trapped inside them were treated as disposable machinery. Jewish prisoners were assigned to labor based on immediate usefulness. Men and women alike were forced into factories producing weapons parts, ammunition, uniforms, and military equipment. Others were sent to rail yards, construction sites, or road crews. Workdays lasted 10 to 14 hours, sometimes longer. There were no days off. Illness was not an excuse. Injury was a liability. Anyone who slowed production risked beatings, imprisonment, or execution. Food rations were calculated with precision. Prisoners received just enough to keep moving, but never enough to recover. Bread was scarce. Soup was thin. Hunger was constant. People learned to conserve energy, to move slowly when guards were not watching, to trade possessions for scraps of food. Starvation weakened bodies rapidly, turning minor injuries into fatal conditions. The system depended on this weakness. It made resistance nearly impossible. Violence was constant but unpredictable. Guards beat prisoners for mistakes, for exhaustion, for looking at the wrong person the wrong way. Punishments were often public, designed to reinforce obedience. Prisoners were forced to watch executions or severe beatings, knowing they could be next. Fear became a tool of management, as effective as any fence or wall. Radom's labor camps were closely linked to local prisons and Gestapo detention centers. If someone was accused of sabotage, disobedience, or resistance, real or imagined, they could disappear overnight. Interrogations were brutal. Torture was routine. Many never returned to the camps at all. Others came back broken, unable to work, and were quickly removed again. The system fed on itself. One of the most terrifying aspects of life in Radom was uncertainty. Prisoners never knew how long they would remain in one place. Transfers were constant. A laborer might be moved from a factory to a prison, from a prison to another camp, from a camp to a transport train, often without explanation. Each movement carried the possibility of death. Trains rarely meant relocation to better conditions. More often, they meant deportation to extermination camps further east. Despite this, people continued to work, to survive, to endure. Survival often depended on skills. Skilled laborers, machinists, metalworkers, tailors, sometimes received slightly better treatment, not out of mercy, but because they were useful. Even then, protection was temporary. Once someone became too weak, too sick, or too slow, usefulness vanished. The city itself became complicit through forced normalization. German authorities ran Radom as if it were a functioning industrial hub. Factories operated, trains ran on schedule, paperwork was filed. All of it masked the reality that an entire population was being destroyed in plain sight. Genocide did not interrupt daily life. It was woven into it. As 1942 turned into 1943, deportations intensified. Entire labor units were dissolved overnight. Prisoners were assembled, counted, and marched to trains under heavy guard. Families were torn apart without warning. Those left behind knew what the trains meant. Rumours of Treblinka spread quickly. Hope narrowed to survival for one more day. Radom's labour camps were never designed for liberation. They were designed to empty themselves through death, deportation, or collapse. And by the time the German grip began to weaken, most of the people who had passed through them were already gone. Radom did not become a killing system overnight. It was assembled piece by piece, decision by decision, order by order. What makes Radom so difficult to grasp, and so important to understand, is that nothing about it appeared extraordinary while it was happening. There was no single moment when the city visibly transformed into a place of death. Instead, persecution unfolded gradually, wrapped in the language of administration and necessity, until violence became routine and disappearance became expected. German occupation authorities governed Radom as a functioning district of the general government. Offices operated daily, clerks processed documents, police units patrolled streets, factory managers filed production reports. The machinery of occupation ran smoothly, and that smoothness was the point. Genocide here did not depend on secrecy. It depended on order. Every restriction placed on the Jewish population was justified as regulation. Identification requirements were framed as security. Ghettoization was presented as public health. Forced labor was described as contribution. Food shortages were blamed on wartime scarcity. Each step isolated, weakened, and controlled, and each step made the next one easier to implement. Once ghettos were sealed, the population inside them became fully visible and fully manageable. German authorities could count people, track them, and assign them. Starvation was introduced methodically. Rations were calculated not to sustain life, but to prolong it just enough for labor. Hunger became a governing tool. A starving population does not organize. It does not rebel. It struggles to survive the day. Outside the ghettos, Radom continued to function. Trams ran, shops opened, factories expanded production. This coexistence of normality and destruction was not accidental. It was essential. By keeping the city operational, the occupation minimized disruption while maximizing exploitation. The suffering of one population subsidized the stability of the whole. Forced labor was the hinge between survival and death. It determined who lived another day and who vanished. Assignments were arbitrary and constantly changing. One day a person might be deemed useful, the next expendable. Productivity became a temporary shield, never a guarantee. Factories in Radom relied heavily on Jewish labor. Workers were marched from camps and ghettos to production sites under guard, collapsing the boundary between imprisonment and employment. The work was punishing. Machines were outdated or dangerous. Accidents were common. Injuries were fatal not because they were severe, but because they disqualified the worker from usefulness. Those who could not work were removed. Removal did not require explanation. Executions occurred quietly and often. People were taken from prisons or camps and shot in nearby forests, courtyards, or abandoned areas. Bodies were buried hastily or left as warnings. These killings were not always recorded in detail, but their impact was unmistakable. People disappeared, and everyone understood why. Radom's prisons and Gestapo detention centers played a central role in terror enforcement. Interrogations were violent. Torture was routine. Accusations of sabotage or resistance, often fabricated, were enough to condemn someone. These institutions existed not just to punish, but to spread fear. Anyone could be taken. No one was safe. Polish civilians lived alongside this system, navigating an impossible moral landscape. Some attempted to help Jews by smuggling food, hiding individuals or passing information. These acts were heroic and deadly. Entire families were executed for assisting a single person. Others remained passive, paralyzed by fear, scarcity, and the constant threat of collective punishment. The Nazis did not require cooperation from everyone. They required silence from most. Public violence reinforced that silence. Beatings and executions were staged deliberately. Prisoners were forced to watch punishments inflicted on others. These spectacles were designed to break solidarity and replace it with survival instinct. When punishment is unpredictable, obedience becomes reflexive. As deportations intensified in 1942, Radom entered its most lethal phase. Lists were prepared, streets were sealed, people were dragged from homes, workshops, and hiding places. Trains waited. The process was fast, brutal, and final. There was no time to understand, only to react, and reaction rarely mattered. The destination for most was Treblinka. The name spread quickly through whispers and rumors. People knew enough to be terrified. Deportation was not relocation, it was annihilation. Those left behind understood that survival was temporary. Labor camps emptied and refilled. Ghettos shrank and disappeared. Each wave removed thousands. Each wave made the remaining population smaller, weaker, and more isolated. What makes Radom distinct is that no single event marks its destruction. There is no liberation scene, no moment when gates opened and survivors emerged en masse. The city emptied gradually. By the time the Germans retreated, there was almost no one left to free. When Soviet forces arrived, they found a city intact but hollow. The infrastructure remained. The factories stood. The rail lines still ran. What was missing was a community. This absence complicated memory. Without a single camp to memorialize, Radom faded from public consciousness. Its story did not fit the dominant Holocaust narrative centered on extermination camps. But absence does not mean innocence. The crime here was distributed, and that distribution made it easier to forget. Survivors who passed through Radom carried a unique burden. Their suffering was harder to explain. They had survived not one camp, but a system. Many felt their experiences were dismissed as secondary, incomplete, or less extreme. Silence followed. Under post-war regimes, Jewish specificity disappeared further. Victims were generalized, records were lost, sites were repurposed. The physical evidence of destruction blended back into daily life. Radom resumed functioning as a city, but without confronting what had happened within it. And that is why Radom matters now, because it exposes how genocide can function without spectacle, how ordinary institutions can become lethal when ethics are replaced by efficiency, how cities do not need to collapse to kill, they only need to comply. Radom forces us to abandon comforting myths. The Holocaust was not always loud. It was not always visible. Sometimes it looked like work schedules, ration cards, police orders, and silence. It looked like a city that kept working while its people vanished. Behind every labor detail, every transport list, and every execution order in Radom were people whose lives had once been full, ordinary, and deeply rooted in the city itself. The Nazi system worked relentlessly to erase that reality, to turn neighbors into statistics and families into logistical problems. But understanding Radom means restoring those lives, even briefly, to view. Because the city was not just a place of suffering, it was a place where an entire community was dismantled piece by piece. Before the occupation, Radom's Jewish population was woven into the fabric of the city. Shopkeepers, craftsmen, factory workers, teachers, rabbis, students, people who knew the streets by heart and assumed they would grow old there. When the ghettos were sealed, that familiarity became a prison. Apartments meant for one family held 3 or 4. Disease spread quickly. Privacy vanished. Hunger dominated every thought. Parents watched children weaken, knowing there was no food to give them. The psychological damage was immediate and permanent. Children were among the most vulnerable. Too young to work effectively, they were often hidden during roundups, smuggled between buildings, or kept silent for hours at a time. Many did not survive the ghetto period at all. Those who did faced deportation or execution during liquidation actions. Childhood in Radom did not end. It was taken. Women carried a double burden. They were forced into labor while also trying to keep families alive under impossible conditions. Many worked in workshops or factories, enduring the same brutality as men. Sexual violence was a constant threat, though rarely documented. Pregnancy was effectively a death sentence. Survival required constant calculation. When to speak, when to disappear, when to trade the last possession for a scrap of food. Men were targeted relentlessly for labor, punishment, and public executions. Any suspicion of resistance, sabotage, or leadership could mean death. Jewish community leaders were often among the first to be killed, not for what they had done, but for what they represented: organization, memory, and cohesion. Resistance in Radom was quiet and fragile, but it existed. Some prisoners sabotaged machinery just enough to slow production without being detected. Others smuggled information, food, or tools. There were attempts to forge documents, to escape, to hide. Each act carried enormous risk. Most failed. Some succeeded briefly. All mattered. Faith, identity, and culture survived in fragments. People whispered prayers. They remembered songs. They taught children when possible. These acts were not symbolic. They were survival. They asserted humanity in a system built to deny it. When deportations resumed in waves, fear became constant. People learned to read signs, which guards were present, which lists were being prepared, which streets were blocked. Some hid. Some volunteered for labor details in the hope of being spared transport. Choices were impossible, and hindsight offers no judgment. Survival was arbitrary. By late 1943 and into 1944, Radom's Jewish population had been nearly annihilated. The ghettos were gone. The labor camps thinned. Those still alive were increasingly transferred to other camps deeper inside the Reich. Survival no longer meant staying in Radom. It meant enduring one nightmare after another. Those who survived Radom carried the city with them for the rest of their lives. The hunger, the fear, the names of people who vanished. Many never spoke of it. Others testified when they could, determined that Radom would not disappear entirely into silence. In the final part, we'll examine what happened after Radom, why its story faded from public memory, and why understanding places like this matters as much as remembering the camps everyone already knows. When Soviet forces entered Radom in January 1945, there was no moment of liberation that fit the images people associate with the end of the Holocaust. There were no crowds of prisoners behind fences, no dramatic opening of gates, no single camp to reclaim. What the soldiers found instead was a city that had already been hollowed out. Factories stood damaged or silent. Jewish streets were empty. Homes that once held families had been looted, reassigned, or simply left to decay. Radom had not been destroyed by one act of violence, but by thousands of smaller ones carried out over years, quiet, methodical, and devastating. The people who had once given Radom its Jewish identity were gone. Some had died slowly in ghettos, weakened by hunger and disease. Others had been worked to death in labor camps tied directly to German industry. Most had been deported east, primarily to Treblinka, where almost none survived. There was no community left to liberate, only absence. This absence made Radom difficult to remember. Unlike Auschwitz or Treblinka, Radom left no single site that could carry the weight of memory. The crime here was spread across the city, in workshops, factories, prisons, courtyards, rail yards, and execution sites. Death did not occur in one place. It occurred everywhere. and because it happened everywhere, it was easy to overlook. For survivors, the end of the war did not bring closure. Those who returned to Radom searched for family members who would never come back. Homes were occupied by strangers, synagogues were destroyed or repurposed. Entire neighborhoods no longer recognized the people who once lived there. Many survivors understood quickly that there was nothing left for them in the city, not just physically, but socially and emotionally. Antisemitism did not disappear with the defeat of Nazi Germany. In post-war Poland, Jewish survivors often faced hostility, suspicion, and violence. Some were attacked for reclaiming property. Others were told to leave. Many chose exile not because they wanted to abandon their homeland, but because staying meant reliving loss every day. Displaced persons camps became temporary refuges. From there, survivors scattered, to Israel, to the United States, to Canada, to Australia, carrying Radom with them in memory alone. Under communist rule, the story of Radom was reshaped once again. Nazi crimes were acknowledged, but Jewish suffering was rarely treated as distinct. Victims were grouped together under broad labels like Polish citizens or victims of fascism. Jewish identity faded from official narratives. The destruction of Radom's Jewish community became just one tragedy among many, stripped of its specificity and depth. Silence replaced testimony. It was not until decades later that historians began reconstructing what had truly happened in Radom. Survivor accounts, German documents, transport records, and local investigations slowly revealed the scale of destruction. What emerged was not a single camp story, but a system. A city transformed into an instrument of genocide through labor exploitation, starvation, terror, and deportation. Radom forces us to confront a difficult truth about the Holocaust. Genocide did not always rely on gas chambers or isolated killing centers. It could unfold through ordinary workplaces, through schedules and quotas, through hunger so normalized that death became routine. Radom shows how an entire population could be destroyed without ever being confined to one infamous camp. This is why Radom matters. When we focus only on the most well-known sites, we risk misunderstanding how genocide actually works. Radom teaches us that destruction can be decentralized, that it can be hidden inside normal life, that cities can function, factories running, trains arriving on time, while entire communities are being erased in plain sight. Today, Radom is once again a living city. People walk its streets unaware of the lives that once filled them. Children play where ghettos once stood. Factories operate where forced laborers once collapsed from exhaustion. Time has moved forward, but time does not erase responsibility. The people who died in Radom were not symbols. They were not statistics. They were shopkeepers, metal workers, students, parents, children. They were erased not because of what they did, but because a system decided they were expendable. Their disappearance was not accidental. It was planned, administered, and carried out step by step. Remembering Radom is not about ranking suffering or competing with more infamous camps. It is about completeness. It is about acknowledging that the Holocaust was not confined to a few locations, but spread across towns, cities, and neighborhoods, places that still exist today. Radom reminds us that genocide does not require secrecy. It only requires bureaucracy, obedience, and time. It requires people willing to follow orders, file paperwork, enforce rules, and look away as others disappear. And time, if we allow it, will bury even the most devastating crimes beneath routine and forgetting. That is why telling this story matters, because once we forget places like Radom, we make it easier for similar systems to emerge again, quietly, efficiently, and without warning. History doesn't always end with liberation or justice. Sometimes it ends with empty streets, silent factories, and names that were never spoken again. Radom was not just a city under occupation. It was a system that destroyed a community piece by piece, quietly and efficiently, until almost nothing remained. Remembering places like Radom isn't about the past alone. It's about understanding how ordinary cities can become instruments of cruelty when humanity is stripped away. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe forgotten history deserves to be remembered, then this is exactly what we do here on History in the Trenches. Make sure to like this video so it reaches more people, subscribe for more deep dives into overlooked chapters of history, and share this story. Because silence is what allows these systems to exist, and remembrance is how we fight back.